Meeting will come to order, consistent with our policy to start on time. We'll be doing that. Good morning. Today we're considering the nomination of Dr. Mark Esper to be Secretary of Defense. We thank all for being here today. We will anticipate during your opening remarks, Dr. Esper, that you'll introduce any members who are of your family who are here and other support groups. It is standard. We do have the 8 required questions you'll have to respond to audibly so we can get that in the record. Have you adhered to the applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest?
Yes, sir.
Have you assumed any duties or taken any actions that would appear to presume the outcome of the confirmation process?
No, sir.
Exercising our legislative and oversight responsibility makes it important that this committee, its subcommittees, and other appropriate committees in Congress receive testimony, briefings, reports, recordings, records, and other information from the executive branch on a timely basis. Do you agree, if confirmed, to appear and testify before this committee when requested?
Yes, sir.
Do you agree to provide records, documents, and electronic communications in a timely manner when requested by this committee, its subcommittees, or other appropriate committees of Congress, and to consult with the requester regarding the basis for any good faith delay or denial in providing such records?
Yes, sir.
Will you ensure that your staff complies with deadlines established by this committee for the production of reports, records, and other information, including timely responding to hearing questions for the record?
Yes, sir. Will
you cooperate in providing witnesses and briefers in response to congressional requests?
Yes, sir.
And finally, will those witnesses and briefers be protected from reprisal for their testimony and briefings?
Yes, sir.
We need a confirmed leader to guide the Department of Defense through the time. Probably we'd always say the same thing, the most challenging time. Senator Reid and I agree with this. A confirmed Secretary of Defense will be more effective in the Pentagon, in Washington, and around the world. And Dr. Esper, you have been nominated to lead the Department of Defense and America's military through the historic transition. In the last decade, America's main focus was counterterrorism. We believe our military had the best of everything. The last administration even thought we could cut our defense budget by hundreds of billions of dollars while fighting 2 wars, and everything would turn out fine. We found out that that was not the case. While the cut in our defense budget was taking place, it was actually between the 2 years of 2010 and 2015, the cuts actually were a 25%. And according to The Economist, this is a document that Senator Wicker first called our attention to, and we checked out afterwards, found it to be everything that was in this article to be accurate. That while we were cutting ours 25%, the Chinese were increasing their military spending in that same time frame by 83%. And today we find ourselves in a new and different moment for America's security. The American people can no longer take America's military superiority for granted. China and Russia have passed us in key areas and are catching up in other areas. The National Defense Strategy, which is the document that we have used, which we've talked about and had a hearing on, and everyone agrees that this was a bipartisan document, and that was one that should be used and has been used for that purpose. So President Trump has supported a new national defense strategy with his defense budgets, putting us to a path to repair readiness and restore our military advantage. Hard work remains. Most importantly, we need a budget agreement. If we do not get a budget agreement, deal with the fiscal year 2020 that includes the growth in the top line, we will squander the process and the progress that we've made in fiscal years 18 and 19. As we all know, our fiscal year, our top line in the first of this new administration's was at $700 billion, and then after that, for the next fiscal year 19, was $716 billion, and then, of course, this bill, we are at $750 billion. We want to avoid the CRs. I think we all agree with that. The NDS Commission report said, quote, unpredictable and delayed funding placed the national defense security in jeopardy. But this isn't only about money. We can't buy our way out of the competition with China and Russia. We need urgent change and significant scale. And that requires hard choices about threat priorities, critical defense investments, and new operational concepts. And these are choices that can only be made by a strong Secretary of Defense who enjoys the trust and confidence of the President and who has the support of those entrusted with critical civilian leadership positions in the Department of Defense. And we'll recognize Senator Reid for his opening statement, then recognize Senator Kane for an introduction. Senator Reid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I join you in welcoming Secretary Esper to this morning's hearing. I would also like to welcome Secretary Esper's family, including his wife, Leah, and their children, Luke, John, and Kate. This effort is obviously not just the individual member, but the family, too, and we appreciate their service to the nation over many years. We're all pleased you could be here. Secretary Esper, as we review your qualifications to serve as Secretary of Defense, I note that you have a wealth of experience in defense policy, including recent service as the Secretary of the Army. Prior to that, you also served in senior leadership positions in both the public and private sector. If confirmed as the next Secretary of Defense, your background experience should serve you well. It has been nearly 7 months since the Department has had a Senate-confirmed Secretary of Defense. At no other time has the office of the Secretary remained vacant for so long. Complicating the situation is that under the Vacancies Act, Secretary Esper cannot serve as the Acting Secretary of Defense now that he has been nominated for that position. Therefore, Secretary of the Navy Spencer is serving as the Acting Secretary of Defense while the Senate considers Secretary Esper's nomination. Given these extraordinary set of circumstances, the Chairman and I agree that it is important to consider the nomination of Secretary Esper as expeditiously as possible. But let me be clear, his confirmation should not be a routine matter. While Secretary Esper has been performing the duties of the Secretary the past several weeks and has served admirably as the Secretary of the Army, the duties of the Secretary are unique. As such, I believe it is incumbent upon this committee to vigorously vet his nomination and review his qualifications. Secretary Esper, as we consider your nomination, we must bear in mind the national security challenges facing our country. Currently, the Department is focused on competition with near-peer adversaries like China and Russia, as the Department pursues the new strategic direction established by the National Defense Strategy. Also, Iran and North Korea remain dangerous, and the threat posed by violent extremist organizations is not diminishing. Furthermore, the Department must continue to recruit and retain high-caliber individuals while restoring readiness and pursuing new high-end capabilities for the force. I specifically want to raise two issues related to this committee's duty to conduct congressional oversight of the Department. First, any effort to withhold or curtail information necessary to fulfill the committee's oversight mandate is unacceptable. Former Acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan recently promulgated a memo governing the committee's access to certain documents, including executive orders or exords. The memo stated in part that the Trump administration would determine which materials should be provided to Congress based on whether the request contains sufficient information to demonstrate a relationship to a legislative function. I think we make that determination, not the Department of Defense. Tensions often exist between the executive and legislative branches regardless of political party. However, as duly elected officials, this committee understands what information is necessary to conduct congressional oversight. We are judicious in the number of requests we make to the Department, and we rigidly control and protect the sensitivity of the information provided us for oversight purposes. Second, the Department must keep Congress fully and currently informed of major military developments. For example, on May 5th, the President's National Security Advisor announced that the U.S. was deploying a carrier strike group and a bomber task force to CENTCOM in response to a number of troubling and escalatory indications involving Iran. The threats were apparently significant enough to not only to surge additional military capabilities in the region, but for Secretary Pompeo to cancel a meeting with German Prime Minister Merkel in order to fly to Iraq. But it took the Department of Defense more than 5 days to share any information with Congress. I find that unacceptable. Secretary Esper, you indicated in your advanced policy questions that if confirmed, you will reassess the Department's exort policy. I appreciate your assurance, and I hope that you will also make a concerted effort to keep this committee fully and currently informed on critical national security developments, particularly if it involves surging additional military capabilities to a specific region. Based on our working relationship during your tenure as Secretary of the Army, I am confident we can work together to ensure that Congress has the information it needs to do the job. Secretary Esper, as was discussed during General Milley's confirmation hearing last week, there is a staggering number of senior-level civilian vacancies throughout the Department. The constant turnover of senior civilian leadership, coupled with the duration of these vacancies, has been troubling. Every member of this committee wants to ensure that high-caliber candidates serve in the Department, and we will continue to fully evaluate and expeditiously consider nominees for these positions. Secretary Esper, if confirmed, your ability to effectively manage the difficult challenges facing the Department, as well as extensive Pentagon bureaucracy, will require strong civilian leadership. I am concerned that the Defense Department is adrift in a way I have not seen in my whole time on Capitol Hill. Your success may even be contingent upon ensuring these civilian vacancies are filled quickly and with capable and talented individuals. It is my hope that you will work with the White House to impress upon them the importance of filling these positions. Finally, let me close with the following. If you confirmed, you will help oversee national security policy for a president whose temperament and management skills are challenging and likely very different from your own. While I do not agree with the President on many policy issues, I do want him to be surrounded by leaders who can provide thoughtful advice and counsel. Diversity of opinion is important when crafting policy and making decisions that impact the well-being of our men and women in uniform. If confirmed, you must be willing and able to provide the President with your best policy advice, even if the President disagrees with your counsel and it runs contrary to his policy goals. But most importantly, while the Secretary of Defense serves at the pleasure of the President, we should never forget that they also oversee the finest fighting force in the world, men and women who have volunteered to serve a cause greater than themselves. Our service members and their families should always be at the forefront when considering defense policy or military action. Secretary Esper, if confirmed, I am confident that you will do so. Again, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I look forward to the hearing and hearing from our nominee. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Reed. Senator Kane, you are recognized to introduce our guest today.
Mr. Chair, Ranking Member Reed, and my colleagues on the committee, I actually will not introduce Dr. Esper because you all know him, but I will present him to you and recommend his nomination. You know him because of his work as Secretary of the Army and interaction with each of you. Barbara Tuchman wrote in her 1962 Pulitzer Prize-winning book about the First World War, The Guns of August, that, quote, character begets power, especially in hours of crisis. That is a quote that is about both individuals and also about nations. Over the past 2 years, my interactions with Dr. Esper have convinced me, have led me to the conclusion that he is a person of sound character and moral courage, which I believe are the most important traits of a Secretary of Defense charged with the lives of the women and men who serve the Department of Defense. He was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, the same town that produced General George C. Marshall, who also as an adult found his way to becoming a Virginian like Dr. Esper. He spent the majority of his adult life in service to the country, starting with his entry into the United States Military Academy at West Point and continuing through his career in the Army, active, Guard, Reserve, service to the White House, service to this body. In fact, Dr. Esper has really sort of seen it all as an active Guard and Reserve member, work in the private sector, work in think tanks on national security policy, service to House and Senate committees, service to individual senators, and service to 2 Republican administrations. You're familiar with his biography, but I just wanted to share 2 instances of working together with Dr. Esper, which has led me to the conclusion that he is the person of character who should lead the department. One of the first phone calls I received after I introduced legislation to address challenges with the unacceptably high unemployment rate of military spouses was from then Secretary Esper, who thanked me for the legislation, who talked about his own concern about this as Secretary of the Army and wanted to work together to tackle this very, very serious challenge. And we have worked together cooperatively on that, and I've been pleased with the Army's ongoing efforts in that way. The same commitment to address the quality of life of our military families was something that I noticed when this committee began the investigation into the very painful circumstances surrounding substandard military housing. The initial responses by some in the department and at the bases themselves, and I think we all experienced this, were skepticism, disbelief, denial, avoidance. That was not the response of Secretary Esper. It was the Department of the Army that first developed the Tenant Bill of Rights, which became the basis of one of the key provisions that we included in the NDAA this year. Secretary Esper extended an invitation for Senator Warner and I to accompany him to see the conditions of housing at Fort Belvoir, just 20 miles south here in Virginia Army Base. When a secretary asks you to do something, you kind of wonder if you're going to see the Potemkin Village version of it, that, you know, we've sort of solved this and we're proud of our solution. No, we didn't see that. Secretary Esper took us to the unvarnished version of problematic housing and people who had been treated badly and couldn't get help from their chain of command or the private housing companies. And we heard in a very blunt way about problems these families had experienced that were heartbreaking in some ways. And we had a roundtable discussion with other families around the table. And when the families presented their experiences, encouraged by Secretary Esper to do so, and then often base personnel would begin to respond if he detected any delay or we can't deal with that right away. Secretary Esper, in a firm and professional way, but a very tough way, would not let people get by with substandard responses. He insisted that the families be dealt with fairly and promptly. That willingness to display personal accountability was very, very impressive both to Senator Warner and me. He's been proactive and he's been transparent. I acknowledge the comments made by the ranking member about the need for transparency in working with the committee. And I think those are trademarks of exceptional leadership. Most of us were very discouraged by the resignation of Secretary Mattis. And what we've hoped for is a successor who could show the same level of candor and principle and a willingness to remain independent even in the most challenging circumstances. I believe that Dr. Esper has those traits and would encourage all of my colleagues to support his nomination. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Whether you call it that or not, I call it an excellent introduction. And Dr. Esper, you are recognized for what comments you want to make, and your entire statement will be made part of the record.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wish Senator Kane could stay here for the next couple hours next to me. Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, and distinguished members of the committee, it is an honor and a privilege to appear before you as the President's nominee for Secretary of Defense. And I'd like to especially thank Senator Kane for that very kind, gracious, humbling introduction. Sir, I will not let you down. You have been a leader here in the Senate. You've been a leader because you are a father of Marine. You've always taken care of our servicemen and women. And as you mentioned, I've really enjoyed working closely with you these past couple years, and our experience at Fort Belvoir, again, assured me that there is bipartisanship in this building on Capitol Hill, and there are leaders out there who will do the right thing, and I know you will continue to demonstrate that leadership for our servicemen and women, for your constituents, for our nation. So thank you very much. I deeply appreciate your remarks. I want to thank the President for this opportunity and for his confidence in me. I'm grateful for the time that many of you have spent with me in recent weeks and thankful for the committee's swift attention to my nomination. Although I've served 22 days as the Acting Secretary of Defense, today I appear before you as the Secretary of the Army in accordance with the Vacancy Act. I would like to begin by recognizing my wife, Leah, and our children, Luke, John, and Kate, who join me today. Like all military families, they have made many sacrifices in support of my service to the nation. Over the past 20 months, Leah has traveled with me many times to meet with Army families and spouses in both the United States and abroad. As a former military spouse herself, she has been an invaluable asset as we focused on a range of family issues. So I want to publicly thank her for her support, and am confident that if I am confirmed, she will assist me in taking care of our great families across the entire Department of Defense. As many of you know, I am blessed to have served our country in a variety of capacities, on active duty in the regular Army for over 10 years, in both the United States and abroad, during both war and peace. On reserve duty in the National Guard and Army Reserve for another 11 years, on Capitol Hill as a personal committee, and leadership staffer in the House and the Senate. In the Pentagon, first as a war planner in the Army, second as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, and third as a reserve augmentee working for the Office of Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. And of course, I also worked in the private sector with a major corporation, a commission focused on China, and at a think tank. And most recently, for nearly 2 years as Secretary of the Army. I believe this broad and diverse experience prepared me well for the position of Secretary of Defense. If confirmed, I intend to bring the same focus, energy, professionalism, thoughtfulness, and commitment to the Department of Defense that I brought every single day to my position as Army Secretary. I'm an avid supporter of the National Defense Strategy and its clear-eyed assessment of the strategic environment we find ourselves in today. The growing threats posed by great power competitors such as China and Russia warrant a refocus to high-intensity conflict across all of the military services. This requires us to modernize our forces and capitalize on rapid technological advancements in the fields such as artificial intelligence, robotics, directed energy, and hypersonics. We must also build more robust cyber capabilities, and with your help, establish the United States Space Force. At the same time, we must be prepared to respond to regional threats such as Iran and North Korea, all the while maintaining pressure on terrorist groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. This need to balance current readiness with modernization is the Department's central challenge and will require strong leadership, open and continuous dialogue with Congress, and the courage to make tough decisions. If confirmed, I intend to continue advancing the strategic goals set forth by my predecessors along 3 lines of effort. First, we will continue to build a more lethal force by increasing readiness and modernizing for the future. The goal is to deter war, and this can only be done with a strong, modern, and ready military that is overmatched in all domains. Our adversaries must see diplomacy as their best option because war with the United States will force them to bear enormous costs. Second, we will continue to strengthen our alliances and attract new partners. A strong network of like-minded nations that are willing and able to fight together is an advantage that our adversaries do not possess. At the same time, I will continue to press our allies and partners to contribute more equitably to our shared security, as many other Secretaries of Defense have done in the past. And third, we will reform the Department, beginning with the Fourth Estate. No reform is too small. In the Army, we found billions of dollars in savings by overturning hundreds of small stones that many said wouldn't make a difference. I will also continue to take the approach that bureaucratic processes should not come at the expense of our men and women serving around the world. The bottom line is this: in an era of mounting fiscal challenges and competing demands, we must actively seek ways to free up time, money, and manpower to invest back into our top priorities. Lastly, as a personal priority of mine, I intend to place particular focus on the well-being of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and their families. I understand very well the impact that issues such as housing and child care and spousal employment have on the readiness of our service members. I heard this firsthand during the dozens of town halls and private meetings that my wife and I held across the Army over the last 20 months. Our military families are willing to make great sacrifices for their country, and in return, I am committed to ensuring they are cared for properly. As promised to this committee during my confirmation hearing to become Secretary of the Army, if confirmed, I will approach these priorities with the values and behaviors proven to maximize effectiveness of any team, to act with integrity, to collaborate broadly, to treat others with dignity and respect, to encourage innovation, critical thinking, and straight talk, to empower people, and to hold leaders accountable. These principles and the values we hold dearest as a profession must be lived and promoted and upheld day in and day out by leaders. Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, and members of this committee, thank you again for your time and consideration today. I am truly honored to be part of the greatest military in the world, and if confirmed, I will continue to work closely with this committee and the entire Congress as we prepare to meet the challenges that lie ahead. I am grateful for your consideration of my nomination, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Esper. Senator Kane made a couple comments about your accompanying him to installations in this area. And I was reminded that you accompanied me in some of these areas also. And you went beyond just the Army. We're down at Fort Sill together. We're talking about the housing problems and the fact that initiated the first time we heard about housing problems, or actually was in Tinker Air Force Base. You were aware of that. But on that meeting that we had, the trip that we had together at Fort Sill, the thing that impressed me, and I think it fits into this this hearing today, was how well you did in communicating with the troops in the field. I mean, you were one of them, and I just at that time I thought, you know, you're really the guy for this job.
Well, thank you, Mr.
When you were with us in the 26th, no, it was in June, you were actually the acting Secretary of Defense at that time. You said that the U.S. National Defense Strategy remains our guiding document. This is really significant. This hasn't happened before. We had a hearing about this. This was put together by Democrats, Republicans, people who were top military people in this country. And no one at any time since we adopted this thing well over a year ago has complained that it wasn't done properly. And so at that time you talked about why it was important. And also prior to that, in March, when you were the Army Secretary, you, in response to one of my questions, you said, quote, Senator, you made a very important point. You said that what we need a budget. The Russians are modernizing. We must build the next generation of combat systems now before Russia and China outpace us with their modernization programs. And we know that that's actually what is happening today. And by the way, Secretary Mattis, and I appreciated the comment that Senator Kane made about him, and those were my sentiments also. But he agreed with that this is what we needed to be doing and how important it was. So in the opening statement, I talked about the fact that the document that appeared, or the article that appeared in The Economist, showed that in the same period of time that we were cutting our military spending by 25%, China was increasing theirs by 83%. Now, you know, the people out there don't know this. They don't realize that we have competition that's out there that we've not had before. And when I see this, I look and I think that we've done really we've done a better job, but we need to do a better job than we've done before. General Milley when he became Chief of Staff, only 5% of our Army brigades were at the highest level of readiness. Now it's 50%. Now that's a huge increase. So we're in the right area and we're moving the right direction. So anyway, in terms of the budget, this is your opportunity to weigh in on this and what we're going to have to do in order to do the job that needs to be done at this time, considering that we have peer competitors we've never had before. And so I'd like to have you use whatever time you need to use and talk about the significance of the budget deal that we're going to have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I fully share all of your remarks, and the threat posed to us over the long run by China cannot be overstated. And so for those reasons, I fully support the President's budget, the need for a 2-year budget deal, and of course the need to have the authorizations and appropriations bills passed on time. I cannot, again, overstate how important it was for DOD last year to receive a budget on time. It really allowed us to accelerate the readiness gains that we made, to advance our modernization efforts, and do all those things that the National Defense Strategy tells us to do.
Okay, that's good. And also, we had asked General Milley when he was in about to kind of classify the areas that we have, to highlight the areas where we need to catch up. And he mentioned nuclear triad modernization, space, artificial intelligence, and hypersonics. Now, you touched on this in your opening statement. Is there anything you want? What would be your priorities in this list, or should this be a longer list than it is?
Well, this may sound unconventional, but it goes to Senator Reed's first point, is if confirmed, I need to staff up the top tier of the Pentagon soonest. When we talk about the bigger picture issues that you mentioned, clearly modernization, the triad, is top priority. I think we need to fully develop the domain of space as a warfighting domain. We need to improve our capabilities and policies with regard to cyberspace. And then, of course, there are a wide range of conventional capabilities we need to improve, and many of those hinge on core technologies that we can speak about through the course of the hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Esper. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thank you. In your opening remarks, you mentioned the continuing tensions between the United States and Iran, and Secretary of Defense Robert Gates reportedly made the following statement: "If you think the war in Iraq was hard, an attack on Iran would, in my opinion, be a catastrophe. Iranian capacity to wage a series of terror attacks across the Middle East aimed at us and our friends and dramatically worsen the situation in Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and elsewhere is hard to overestimate." Do you agree with Secretary Gates' assessment if there was a...
I agree. We do not want war with Iran. We are not seeking war with Iran. We need to get back on the diplomatic channel.
And that raises the obvious question, how do we take steps that would mitigate possible escalation leading to kinetic activity? How do you do that?
A couple things. First of all, what we try to do is trying to foreclose the opportunity for any miscalculation and misunderstanding by developing a concept, which I understand that we've set up a meeting to brief this committee on here soon, called Operation Sentinel, whereby we do passive patrolling, if you will, in the Strait of Hormuz, Gulf of Oman, and the Persian Gulf to deter any provocative acts by the Iranians or the IRGC. At the same time, from the highest levels of government, from the President himself, we said we will meet anytime, anywhere, without precondition to discuss issues with the Iranians to get us on the diplomatic path.
So you think that diplomatic path is the most thoughtful way to proceed?
Diplomacy always is.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, you will likely be required in the course of your duties to opine with regard to Section 2808 with respect to the use of emerging funding already appropriated for critical military projects to be used, in the case most obviously presented to you, for a border wall construction. The legal requirement is that it must be necessary to support the use of the armed forces along the border with Mexico. Given the fact that this is a law enforcement operation, given the fact that it's not something that is typically in the operational spectrum of military forces to build walls across a border, how can you make that justification?
Well, that is something that I will need to take a look at if confirmed, Senator, and obviously we'll look at the advice provided to me by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But in many ways, the operations that DOD is providing at the border in support of DHS is not unlike what we've done in the past through multiple administrations over many years. I think in many ways it's just one of those things we do, whether it's putting out wildfires in California, helping with hurricane recovery in Texas or Puerto Rico, flooding along the Mississippi. It's one of those things we provide to other parts of the government, to the American people.
I guess one area, though, is that you would be diverting funds from projects that you have come to us and said are absolutely critical to the military readiness, posture, and operations for a activity which is long-term. This is a multi-year project. This is not something like a flood where you have to rush in with forces immediately within days, hours, literally. Right. There is a distinction, and I think you should not miss that distinction.
No, I agree, and obviously as we proceed, if confirmed, I'd want to have discussions with you and be very transparent as we move through that process.
Let me return to my comment about exhorts. I would hope that you could commit to us publicly that you'd immediately take a thorough review and that you would revise the memorandum so that we could operate in a custom that I think this committee has done with the Department of Defense over many, many years, far preceding my tenure on the committee. Is that something you would commit to?
I will definitely commit to that, Senator, and as I think you highlighted, I spent my formative years in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. I know why Congress is Article 1, and I know you have important oversight functions.
You mentioned the importance of allies and partners, Mr. Secretary, and there's been, I think, obviously a discordance between some of the statements which the administration have made with regard to NATO, for example, with regard to our relationships with many of our allies, the South Koreans, the Japanese. Do you think we can improve not only the rhetoric, but the substance of our relationship with our allies?
There's always room for improvement with the relationship between our allies. You know, I was appointed as Acting Secretary on June 24th. On June 25th, I took off on a plane and flew to Brussels to meet with our allies at the Defense Ministerial. And one of the messages that I want to carry forth is this administration's and my personal commitment to NATO, as somebody who served in NATO, that our Article 5 commitments were ironclad and that we would continue to build in a number of areas to strengthen those partnerships and relationships.
A final question. In your dialogue with our colleagues in NATO, did they raise the issue of the apparent discordance and diminishment of the relationships between our allies? Was that a significant point they raised?
Actually, I don't recall that coming up. We discussed a range of issues, whether it involved our operations in Afghanistan, how we're strengthening the alliance, but that particular point did not come up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Wicker.
Secretary Esper, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for your service. It's obvious from listening to both sides of the aisle here from my colleague, Senator Kaine, and also Chairman Inhofe, that based on their direct observation and work with you, both of them think you're an all-star. I tend to agree. I think your testimony has been right on today, and you're going to need to be an all-star because of the challenges that Senator Inhofe has mentioned. Let me also tell you something that you already know. On this committee, Chairman Inhofe and Ranking Member Reed work together as a team. There's some nuances in how they would approach things, but the way they've directed this committee in the writing of the NDAA, I hope sends a message to the rest of the world, to those adversaries that Senator Inhofe was referring to in that article from The Economist, that we intend to give you and the admirals and generals that will be working with you the tools you need to meet the challenges. Now, our NDAA, which has been passed by the Senate, is at $750 billion. The NDAA passed by the House, $733 billion. A difference of $17 billion. We're not mathematicians up here, but Senator Fisher and I have been talking with staff. That's about 2.3% difference. And so I would say to my colleagues and say to you, if the House and Senate cannot, in the next few days, work out the difference between 2.3% in our versions and agree on a two-year budget caps number, then shame on us. We're not doing our duties. We are the Article I branch of the government. We're the only people on the face of the earth, only people in the country that can do this. And we must negotiate it with the President of the United States. The Secretary of the Treasury has been tasked with negotiating with House and Senate leaders on this. But I hope you'll raise your voice and be a strong advocate. I hope at this very moment you're raising your voice. We need a budget number this month. If we get to September 15th, we start having brinksmanship and uncertainty about what we're going to do with this budget number. That becomes a problem. And thank you for talking about the things we're going to need to modernize. We're trying to bring our military up to date and then to look to the future. And so you mentioned on page 3 of your testimony, artificial intelligence, robotics, directed energy, hypersonics, and the next sentence, robust cyber capabilities. If we go to a month-long CR, perish the thought that we would go to a one-year CR. We go to a month-long CR, October 1st. What does it do to these things which you've listed on page 3 of your testimony as priorities?
Every day that a CR continues is one less day that we can invest in future capabilities and future technologies at the same time, because a CR, of course, prohibits new starts. and we are stuck funding, if you will, legacy technologies or legacy equipment. And that's just in terms of modernization, Senator. If you look at readiness, manning, equipping, same problems. It just gets worse and worse over time, and in many cases, you can never make it up. If it comes to training, you cannot make that up.
So it's different from level funding. If somehow we could magically wave a magic wand and have level funding with an appropriation bill, that would be a different matter. But a CR doesn't do that, does it?
I think anybody who's served in business will tell you that steady, predictable funding is a key to success, because you can manage your workforce, you can organize how you work in ways that are far more efficient than looking at inconsistent and unpredictable funding coming your way.
Now, what does a CR, even a temporary CR, do to Senator Kane's shipyards? What does it do to military and defense manufacturing as a whole during that period? And does it save us money?
Well, again, for a New Start program, under a CR, new starts are prohibited, so you would not be able to begin a new program, launch a new program. Of course, when you speak to the shipyards, you typically have lower levels of funding, so it affects your operations and maintenance accounts, so you typically face challenges with regard to maintenance. And again, the challenges go on, and in many cases, you cannot make that up. So instead, you are trapped in a situation where you're likely spending fewer dollars on legacy items, on legacy modernization priorities.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it that we get this budget number?
11.
Thank you. You're no mathematician either. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Esper, for your willingness to consider taking on this very difficult challenge at this critical time. Secretary, we had the opportunity to visit last week. I appreciated your coming in to talk to me. One of the things that we discussed was the challenge of PFAS contamination that impacts more than 400 military installations across the country. One of those is former military installation at Pease, the former Pease Air Force Base in New Hampshire. And the Air Force has been quite responsive to the challenges of that contamination affecting the drinking water for the city of Portsmouth. But it's becoming more and more a serious issue, not just on military installations, but across the country. So if confirmed, can you commit to taking a stronger, more proactive stance to address PFAS contamination issues that are affecting our installations and communities?
Absolutely, Senator. This is an important issue. We need to own it. And I don't know if we have a task force, for example, in place, but if confirmed, that is something that I would look at doing to make sure that all the services are coordinated and we're approaching the problem in an aggressive and holistic way.
Thank you very much. Another challenge that we're seeing in New Hampshire is with the KC-46 refueling tankers. General Lyons, the commander of TRANSCOM, indicated that he was making preparations to push back the retirement of 28 legacy tankers, and expressed concern about the costs that have been associated with this decision. I recently learned that as many as 121 active duty airmen from Pease who have been there to support those new refueling tankers who are going to arrive at Pease. We're one of the first National Guard bases to receive those tankers, but they've been moved to continue to fly at other air bases to support the tanker operation capabilities that need to remain in service. So if confirmed, can you commit to a review of the KC-46 program and the second and third order effects that we are now seeing as a result of these delays?
Absolutely, Senator, and I think in the wake of our meeting, I understand that you received a letter from Air Mobility Command committing that those billets will not be moved, and in due course, they actually increase the number of billets. I think the big issue that I need to go back and work with you on as well is what is the timing at which those aircraft return to Pease? And to me, that as I look at it. So you have my commitment on that. You and I work together on things, and I think you know I'll follow through.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. The 2019 Worldwide Threat Assessment of the U.S. Intel community notes that our adversaries and strategic competitors will look to the 2020 U.S. elections as an opportunity to advance their interests. You mentioned in your opening statement the challenges with cyber capabilities that we have. The report specifically mentions that Russia's social media efforts will continue to focus on aggravating social and racial tensions, undermining trust in authorities, and criticizing perceived anti-Russian politicians. Can you talk about whether the Department of Defense is working on deterrence, cyber technology, and researching techniques to respond to adversaries like Russia who are interested in affecting our elections?
Yes, Senator, we do work as part of a whole-of-government approach. We, of course, have exceptional capabilities in our cyber command, and maybe as important as our capabilities, last year the administration put out a new NSPM 13, which really put our cyber capabilities on a more offensive footing, allowing us to lean forward. And I think for those reasons, it's why you saw in the 2018 elections no issues. And that's why I think we're more and more confident that the 2020 elections will also be unfettered, if you will. I understand we gave you a briefing last week, the House and the Senate. Hopefully that was reassuring. But this is something that we must stay on top of. The integrity of our elections, the criticality of our democracy is something that cannot be influenced or threatened. And so we are committed to more than playing our fair share in that regard.
Well, thank you. I very much appreciate that. Both the chairman and ranking member mentioned the openings that exist within the Department of Defense. You and I also discussed that, and your commitment to try and address that as soon as possible. Have you discussed with the President or the White House the need to cooperate in filling those positions as expeditiously as possible and the need to fully vet any nominees who are offered?
Senator, I met yesterday before I handed over the secretaryship, if you will, to Secretary Spencer. I met with a representative from White House personnel. We went down the list of the 14 current slots that do not have a Senate-confirmed person and talked about each. And obviously, I urged them to help us push folks through. We have a few folks that will be coming here before the committee or on the executive calendar right now. And then I have due diligence back in the Pentagon to make sure that we find names, we recruit the right people for the 4 or 5 seats that still need to be filled. So there's a range of responsibilities, and I did have that meeting yesterday with the White House to discuss that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your service to this country, and thank you for your willingness to continue to serve as the Secretary of Defense. In our meeting last week, you made one point that I wanted to touch on again. In a strategic environment defined by great power competition, the most effective method of preventing great power conflict, and that is our nuclear deterrence, is of growing importance. Do you want to elaborate on that? I recall that the Global Zero report from several years ago arguing that we should reduce our nuclear forces because, quote, 9/11 exposed the lack of efficacy, indeed the irrelevance of nuclear forces in dealing with 21st century threats, end quote. I don't think that argument was valid then, and I certainly don't believe that it is valid now. What are your thoughts?
You know, Senator, I had the privilege of working on these issues in the past up here on Capitol Hill. You know, I'm convinced after studying them for quite some time that a nuclear deterrent is essential to our security. It's a top priority. It has kept the peace with regard to deterring nuclear war for 70 years now. And so I think the important part is to ensure that we have a modern, effective, credible, and safe and reliable deterrent. And so that's why we need to look at each leg of the triad. Each provides certain capabilities to complement one another, and continue to modernize that triad is important to our safety and security.
Earlier this year, we heard from Undersecretary Lord, and she stressed that we have reached a point where delay of modernization is no longer an option. Do you agree with her characterization that we don't have any margin of error in any of the programs, any leg of the triad, and that we must move forward with that modernization?
It's clear that we do. Each leg is in a different status, if you will. We need to certainly modernize the GBSD, the ground-based strategic deterrent. Obviously, we have plans to modernize the Ohio-class submarines, and then there obviously is a program underway already to modernize our long-range stealth bombers.
We saw with the House NDAA some of their concern with the GBSD. You mentioned that as an important point, that we cannot let up on that in modernization. Is that correct?
That's correct. They are an important leg of the triad. They provide some capabilities that other legs of the triad do not. So for those reasons, I think it's important that we maintain that.
You were recently in Brussels, and you had a meeting with other NATO defense ministers, and I know one of the topics that you discussed was the fate of the INF Treaty. And as I'm sure you are aware, critics of the administration continue to promote the narrative that the president's decision to withdraw from that treaty, which has failed solely because of Russia's actions, that's created disunity in our NATO alliance. Was that your impression?
No, Senator, it was not. You know, I'd say a few things. I've worked these issues in the past with regard to arms control. It's Russia has cheated or is cheating on treaties. I give the Obama administration high marks for calling them out and trying to work this, and obviously Secretary Mattis worked this issue as well. I think the INF Treaty has served us well, but it only works if both parties comply, and we have been diligent, we the United States, in complying with the treaty. But in discussions with NATO allies, both bilaterally and in the big room sessions, if you will, I was really impressed by the fact that everybody was unified and agreed that we cannot stand by while Russia arms itself with intermediate-range missiles, SSC-8s, that are nuclear-tipped and have most of Europe within their range. And so we also agreed on a path forward, and we also agreed publicly, I think I mentioned it publicly, that we encourage Russia to come back into compliance. The United States will remain in compliance with all of our obligations until August 2nd. And after that point in time, we will continue to pursue what's in our best interests.
So what are our next steps in response to Russia's violation?
Well, we obviously need to prepare air and missile defenses to defeat those intermediate-range missiles. And the Army has been working on that, as I know the other services are as well. But then the other part is to make sure that we develop our own conventional INF range missiles to deal not just with Russia, but China. Most of China's inventory is of intermediate-range missiles, and so we need to make sure we have the capability as well to respond should we, God forbid, get in a fight with them one day.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Dr. Esper, and thank you for your service to our nation. Thank you to your family as well. We haven't had a chance to visit yet, but I hope before the vote we will have an opportunity to get together. And I hope also that you'll have an opportunity to visit Connecticut, particularly our subbase and our shipyard, which, as you know, is the submarine capital of the world, and perhaps stop by Rhode Island while you're there.
If confirmed, you have my commitment, and maybe in August as soonest.
Wonderful. And that reflects, I think, a commitment that you've reiterated to our superiority in the undersea domain, as well as continued superiority in the air, which involves the F-35 and our helicopter force. And I notice you're nodding for the record.
No, I'm sorry. Yes, I do. I mean, we need to sustain the F-35 program. It's the world's premier fifth-generation fighter, which provides extraordinary capabilities. You mentioned rotary wing. As you know, the Army undertook an initiative, a top priority, to modernize our aviation fleet, future vertical lift. And there are exciting opportunities there that will give us unprecedented range and payload and whatnot. And then I think the third thing you mentioned was we do have to modernize the submarine force, the boomers, if you will. I've had the privilege in the past of being on those vessels. They're very impressive, but they need to be modernized to deal with the challenges we face today and in the future.
I want to ask you about a topic that I raised with then Acting Secretary Shanahan about DoD expenditures at Trump-branded properties. In response to my question to him, the Department provided a list of expenditures made by civilian and uniform Department of Defense personnel at Trump properties between January 20th, 2017 and June 14th, 2017. The total is about $147,000. During just those 6 months, the Pentagon spent over $36,000 at the Trump National Golf Club in Palm Beach, over $35,000 at the Trump Hotel Las Vegas, over $16,000 at the Trump Hotel, Trump Ocean Club Panama, among many other lodging and restaurant expenses at Trump properties. I know you're not a lawyer, but you no doubt understand that the Emoluments Clause forbids the President receiving money from these type of expenditures by government personnel that enrich him as the owner of those properties. I would like a commitment from you that you will provide all of the additional information about official expenditures at these properties from 2017 to the present, and that you will commit to providing also additional information about the official purpose of these government travel expenses, if any, and in fact that you will go further and declare these properties to be off-limit establishments, as the Pentagon does for military personnel when they are spending taxpayer money. This money is taxpayer money. The expenditures were put on the government travel charge card, and I think the American people would have a lot of reservations about this practice.
Yes, sir. Yeah, sir, I will certainly look into the issue and provide as much transparency as you can. Like you said, I'm not a lawyer, but your request sounds like something which I should have a counselor with me to, but I will do my best to get you all the
Well, I'm
information.
asking that you commit to provide the information, not for your legal opinion.
I certainly am committed to provide that information. And this also is an important chance to say one thing, too, is it is very important to me to continue the long-held tradition that DOD remain apolitical. And so my commitment is to make sure that we conduct ourselves that way. So I will certainly look into that information, and I will look into what you're saying. I want to make sure that we are conducting ourselves in a professional and ethical manner at all times.
And I would just add, in response to the answer that you gave to my colleague, Senator Shaheen, about the threat from Russian interference in our elections, I am by no means as comforted as you seem to be by the information available to us about the response so far by our government. It's a whole of government response, but I think that threat is real, urgent, increasing, and so far we've been doing more, but still way short of what is necessary. And that is my impression from the briefing that you referred to, and I'd like your commitment that you will provide us more information about.
Absolutely, Senator. And I did not mean to convey that I'm comfortable with where we stand. I think this is going to be an ongoing threat for some time. Obviously, Russia is the principal issue, but there are other countries out there who would want to influence or change our elections. So I think we need to be on guard and vigilant. And I certainly could not attest today that 2020 will be flawless. But like I said, I think we're in a much better posture in 2018. I think we addressed the problem adequately. But we always will have a lot of work to do because people want to influence our elections.
And one last question. Will you commit to recuse yourself from involvement in any decisions involving Raytheon in light of your past involvement? I know you've committed through November. What about beyond?
I'm fully committed to living up to my ethics obligations, the laws, the regulations, my pledges, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Secretary Esper, for your long history of service to the country, starting first as a young Army officer and continuing with your time here in the Congress and at the Pentagon, and now over the past 2 years as Army Secretary. Thanks for continuing to serve the country in this new capacity. I want to talk briefly about a point that Senator Blumenthal just raised, the period in your career when you were not in government, but you were in industry, specifically at Raytheon. This is obviously not without precedent. Bill Clinton, Secretary of Defense William Perry, did time in the private sector before serving as Secretary of Defense, as did many other notable Pentagon leaders like Frank Kendall of the Obama administration. How many years were you working these issues, starting with your time as a young cadet up until the time you left government service, did you spend before going to Raytheon?
I have spent, since departing my hometown at age 18, 37 years. Easily 25 of those have been in public service.
Dedicated to the defense of this nation?
Dedicated to the defense of the nation, advancing our national security. Absolutely, Senator. It's been my life's work.
Thank you. How long were you at Raytheon?
6.5 years.
Okay. And I would say they have a large presence in South Arkansas, as do most major defense contractors and many other defense contractors, that Raytheon does a lot to contribute to our national security as well. I'm very proud of those Arkansans who are helping. whether they're Raytheon or other defense contractors putting some of the most lethal weaponry in the hands of our troops all around the world. But they are obviously a for-profit company, and they're in competition with those other companies as well. Have you fully divested from Raytheon?
I have fully divested in accordance with all my ethics obligations and requirements.
So you have no ongoing financial stake in the performance of Raytheon?
No, I don't. The only thing I have remaining, which has been listed on my financial disclosure form, is deferred compensation, which is money I earned, which is out there. But it's nothing that they can be influenced, if you will.
Not contingent on Raytheon's performance, either strong or poor. Talk a little bit more about the recusal issue. It's one thing for, say, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense to recuse himself from issues. It's another thing for the Secretary of Defense. There are certain issues of such national import that it's hard for anyone besides the Secretary to make. So could you talk through us about how your recusal from issues related to Raytheon will work?
Yes, sir. Obviously, I have a robust screening process so that anything that comes before me, either written or people appearing before me or briefings, that would be clearly flagged and screened to make sure that I remain compliant. I would remain in constant contact with our ethics personnel, and they're great career professionals who have been very helpful across the way. I also found in my time during as Secretary of the Army, and clearly with this promotion, if confirmed, be even higher, that I really dealt nearly all the time with broad policy matters, strategy, things like that. I never got into the business, if you will, of picking programs or things like that. So I'm fully confident of what my obligations are. And I guess the important thing is to say is this. I've lived an ethical life. I'm going to continue to live by those ethics, those principles, whether it involves Raytheon or any other company for that matter. So it's my commitment to the nation's security. It's my commitment to the men and women in uniform that drives me, not anything else.
I know you have, and I know that you'll continue to live that ethical example for all the men and women of the Department of Defense when you're the Secretary of Defense. I will note that although this is often perceived as an issue for both Republican and Democratic DOD officials alike, members of this committee know that in some cases there's a tendency to actually be too hard on former associates and employers because of the exact kind of perception that is sometimes raised when you leave industry and go into government. Of course, there's lots of advantages of having that kind of industry experience as well. And in my closing moments here, I want to ask you about that. This committee has prioritized opening the Pentagon up to smaller companies, not the giant defense contractors, especially when it comes to leading technology. I have to say that's been done with some limited success. How do you plan to take advantage of your private sector experience to break down those barriers to entry in the Pentagon? And how do you plan to make it an attractive place for startups and firms that don't have, large, very large organization with decades of experience of dealing with government contracting and acquisition at the Pentagon?
So my experience is that in many ways you find your greatest innovation, your greatest entrepreneurship is happening at the smaller levels. Those small shops, those small innovators that are out there creating incredible technologies. That's one reason why in the Army we established Army Futures Command and put it in Austin, Texas to capitalize on those folks who are coming up with the cutting-edge ideas. My time at Raytheon, I spent a lot of time traveling and meeting not just with members of the company, but also their supply chain. And having that supply chain is integral. In many cases, it's fragile. We've talked today about CRs. Often the folks who pay the price of an extended CR or the cancellation of contracts or the lack of a new start are folks way at the end of the supply chain who just don't have the means to sustain themselves. So I'm very conscious, based on my time in business, of what it means to the supply chain, how you have to make sure you nurture them and make sure you have robustness, because it's the robustness that drives both innovation, but also ensures you have the competition that drives down cost and drives up performance.
Well, thanks, Secretary Esper. I guess you won't be getting a new title after the Senate votes to confirm you, but you will have a new job, and I know that you'll continue to set the example of ethical leadership that Senator Kaine praised you for and whose opinion I share.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Esper, thank you for your service to our country. Secretary Esper, in 2014, Secretary Hagel issued new guidance for upgrading certain discharges to honorable. The Hagel policy directed review boards to give, quote, liberal consideration to the possibility that PTSD contributed to a veteran's loss of their honorable discharge. That's why I introduced legislation to codify the principles of this policy into law. The Fairness for Veterans Act was included as Section 535 of the fiscal year 2017 NDAA, and I recently sent a letter to the Department of Defense to get an update on the implementation of this law. I think you'd agree that troops that are suffering from mental trauma associated with their service should not have their records tarnished over an episode of misconduct that may be related to the trauma that they're actually suffering from. So my question to you, sir, is can I get your assurance that this law will be executed as intended under your leadership, if confirmed, and that I can get your commitment to keeping Congress informed of the law's implementation?
Yes, sir. As you described it, it seems to make eminent sense. You know, from my time in uniform, of course, I spent my time in war. I know the impacts. I think things like that go a long way to signaling that we understand that these things happen, that damage, harm is not just physical, it can be mental, and that it also goes a long way to us addressing any stigmatization with regard to mental health issues.
Well, I appreciate that commitment, and I'm hearing from some of my constituents that the wait times of over 12 months for a decision to appeal are occurring, and I'd certainly like you to look into what the department needs, including support from Congress, to expedite these decisions of status upgrades, and hope to get your commitment.
So I mean, the bureaucracy on these things is terrible. We need to just go after it hard, particularly in matters involving, you know, life and health and those things. People can't wait for 12 months to get something like this addressed. So you have my commitment to go after the bureaucracy on that as well.
Great, I appreciate that. Secretary Esper, I'd like to quote from Secretary Mattis, his letter of resignation on December 20th of 2018. He addressed it to President Trump, and he said, and I'm going to quote this, because you have the right to have a Secretary of Defense whose views are better aligned with yours on these and other subjects, I believe it's right for me to step down from my position. And in his resignation letter, he emphasized the value of alliances and the true value to the United States and of the international order. And let me quote again from his letter. He said, it must be conducive to our security, prosperity, and values, and we are strengthened in this effort by the solidarity of our alliances, end of quote. These principles, of course, are difficult to put a price on, but they were clearly essential to Secretary Mattis and something that he was willing to resign as Secretary of Defense. So my question to you is, tell me a little bit about your view on the importance of the U.S.-led international order to support our security, prosperity, and our values. And would you be a Secretary of Defense with views more aligned with Secretary Mattis or more aligned with President Trump?
Well, Senator, you know, as I said in my opening statement, as I messaged to the field on my first day as Acting Secretary, the note I sent to the field said that I fully support the National Defense Strategy to include explicitly Line of Effort 2, which talks about building alliances and strengthening our partnerships. So I'm fully committed to that. I realize the importance of it. The international rules-based order in the wake of World War II is the order that has ensured prosperity and security now for 75 years, and I'm fully committed to that. I think that is the one thing that's certainly under threat from Russia and certainly China. China wants to reorder the global order. They want to do everything from replace institutions to replace the dollar. And so I'm fully committed to that. I see the big picture, if you will, and that's how I come at these problems. It's how I grew up addressing these problems, if you will.
So is it safe to say you're more closely aligned to the views of Secretary Mattis than President Trump?
I don't know that you can, I don't know where to pick between the two, if that will, but clearly I share Secretary Mattis's views, and I've expressed that publicly.
Well, is there an issue or policy that you would be asked to support that would run counter to your values and principles? Would you be willing to resign if it ran counter to your values and principles?
You know, at my time in the Army, I grew up with this view that if you're asked to do anything that is illegal or immoral or unethical, then that would be the point at which you have to consider resignation.
And you'd be willing to do that?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Esper, first of all, I want to thank you for your service to our country, to your family. We recognize that this is one of those challenging times in which you have tried to fill a couple of different positions all at the same time. But your work and your background makes you eminently qualified for the position that we're considering today. I wanted to ask a couple of questions here with regard to that background, which I think helps, but I'm not sure that you've had an opportunity to share with the public. There has been some concern expressed about your time working for Raytheon. I'm curious, though, if you can discuss the insights that you have developed and how this period of your life would inform your decision-making should you be confirmed as Secretary of Defense.
Senator, my years in business really gave me a breadth of experience and knowledge about what makes industry tick, what motivates them. The previous question we had from Senator Cotton, I got a rich understanding of the supply chain, how important it is, and yet how fragile it is at the same time. I understand well what motivates companies in order to grow and change and adapt. And you also get a good understanding of how they organize to address work. You understand their frustrations with DoD bureaucracy and where the possible fixes may be. And so all those things and more, I think, really enabled me as Army Secretary to look hard at all of our programs and to make sure that we got them in the right place. And I will tell you, of the 18 or 19 or so major defense programs that we had, nearly all of them, but maybe one or two, were meeting cost, schedule, and performance because myself and others like Undersecretary McCarthy had brought to the table a business background that helped us understand. In some cases, we leveraged that certainly to stop production or stop acceptance of certain items, and all those things we leveraged to make sure that we got to the warfighter the tools and weapons equipment they need, and we were and tried to be very good stewards of the taxpayer's dollar at the same time.
Let's go to cyberspace for just a minute. We fight not just in the air, on land, on sea, undersea, space, but cyberspace as well. And you have worked as a Secretary of the Army during a time in which cyber has become part of the focal point with regard to our defense strategies. There is a clear understanding that we can always do better and that we divide this out in both defensive and offensive capabilities. You've received some new tools and some new capabilities in the last couple of months. You've got a new presidential directive which replaced PPD 20, which allows you some latitude. You've also got section, I believe it's 1632 of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2018, where you are provided with the use of identifying cyber activities outside of a war zone as traditional military activities. Secretary Spencer of the Navy was recently criticized a little bit, and I think unjustly, for laying out a very timely report in which he identified all of the major challenges that the Department of the Navy has concerning cyber activity. I think he could have used any one of the different departments and come up with the same result. Could you share a little bit with us your thoughts about what our needs are and how serious the threats are with regard to cyber operations, cybersecurity, both defensive and offensive capabilities, and where you see that going with regard to cyber and its connection with the rest of the different domains?
Senator, clearly cyber is a domain of warfare. We are at war, if you will, in the cyber domain now, constantly battling countries such as Russia or China, who are trying to do everything from steal our technology to influence elections, to put out disinformation about the United States. I think on the defensive side, we remain vulnerable, whether it's as a government or in the private sector. You just asked about my experience in the private sector, is that the private sector is also vulnerable. On the offensive side, I think we have a lot of capabilities, but policy had not caught up until, as you said, the passage of NSPM 13. Probably more needs to be done. We need to remain vigilant on that front. And I'm talking at the strategic level. It also applies at the tactical level as well. The Army has done remarkable work, if you will, before preceding me in terms of standing up Army Cyber Command, creating cyber MOSs, creating a cyber officer corps, and really employing those tools at both the tactical and operational level as well. We just have to get used to the fact that this is a new domain of warfare, that we'll probably be in constant conflict with countries below the threshold of kinetic conflict, and that's just the way the world will be from now on. And we have to continue to develop and make sure that we retain cutting-edge capabilities and overmatch in that area.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary, I want to start and just say I appreciate your focus on technologies like artificial intelligence, hypersonics, directed energy. These are our path to real offset advantages over our adversaries. And said another way, these are the path to effective deterrence. So I appreciate that and look forward to working with you on those issues. A little closer to home, at least my home, I was quite pleased to learn that Holloman Air Force Base is one of the 3 finalists chosen as a candidate location for a permanent formal training unit for the F-16. As you know, since 2017, Holloman has actually been home to a temporary formal training unit, providing an unmatched location for producing new pilots and shaping our combat air power. As the Air Force makes its final decision, I would simply ask that you ensure that their selection considers the airspace, the existing facilities, the existing infrastructure, and the very supportive community and the years of successful training that's already there at the existing Holloman Air Force Base.
I will, yes,
Yeah,
sir.
thank you. I want to return to an issue that Senator Shaheen brought up. Unfortunately, New Mexico has also suffered from some quite severe impacts, environmental impacts caused by hazardous chemical runoff at our military installations. And I want to make clear, we are very proud of our military bases in New Mexico. But PFAS at Cannon, as well as Holloman, and jet fuel at Kirtland have had real and adverse impacts on local communities, and in particular on the water tables that they rely on in a dry environment like New Mexico. Water is everything with regard to community and economic development. And for example, a local dairy farmer outside of Cannon Air Force Base lost the entirety of his family business because of PFAS contamination in the water table. So I would just urge that the Department of Defense make remediation of these types of contaminants a top priority. Not just PFAS, but also jet fuel. And fixing these wrongs is not only the right thing to do, but it's what DOD, I believe, owes its military families and the communities that support them day in and day out. And so I would just ask that you commit to me and to this committee that you will make contamination, whether it's jet fuel or PFAS or other things that we've created along the way as we've done this hard work, a top priority for the department.
I do, Senator.
I want to ask one more question here. According to the report on effects of a changing climate to the DOD published in January of this year, I'll quote this, quote, climate effects lead to increased maintenance and repair requirements for training and testing lands and associated infrastructure and equipment, end quote. And I would simply ask if you concur with that statement.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that
Sure.
last part again?
It said that climate effects lead to increased maintenance and repair requirements for training and testing lands and associated infrastructure and equipment.
That's probably true. That's, one of the issues we experienced in the Army as we looked at the impacts of climate change was, particularly in our western bases, was the impacts of desertification on the installation. So I'm sure it's true with New Mexico as well.
Do you think there are ways in which DOD can be more energy resilient as we move forward? Do you have specific thoughts on that?
We do. We have, in fact, we have, I'll speak for the Army. We do have a project, for example, at Fort Drum, where we've done that in Hawaii. I know Senator Hirono's here. We have a multi-fuel project that we put in Hawaii to make sure that we had resiliency and also could provide power to our military there for an extended period of time. So I do think it's something we need to build into it, because we rely heavily on energy. Energy is not cheap, and we need to conserve as much as we can.
Last week during his confirmation meeting, General Milley mentioned the importance of artificial intelligence to DOD modernization. I mentioned several technologies. Can you just share your feelings about the importance of technologies like AI, directed energy, as well as hypersonics in maintaining the advantage that we have historically had?
Yes, sir. You mentioned several top technologies. I share those: hypersonics, directed energy, robotics, autonomy. It's one reason why in the Army we restructured our Rapid Capabilities Office to be the Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technologies Office. Different people put different things as number one. For me, it's artificial intelligence. I think artificial intelligence will likely change the character of warfare. And I believe whoever masters it first will dominate on the battlefield for many, many, many years. It gets to not just how we can think more quickly, how we can work autonomously and semi-autonomously. I just think it's a fundamental game changer. That's why in the Army we stood up an artificial intelligence task force at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. We have to get there first. We have to, because again, whoever gets there first will dominate for many years.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you, and thank you for your family for a lifetime of public service and also for being willing to step up at this point in your career for this huge responsibility. Sir, it seems to me that the world's never been more dangerous than any time in my lifetime than it is right now. 5 threats across 5 domains. You've talked about space and cyber as the 2 added domains today. I want to talk about the rise of China and the relationship that our allies play in that. But I want to clear up one thing today. There are a lot of people who say, well, we spend $730, $750 billion on our military. I would remind everybody we have now for the first time, thanks to you and others and the President, that we have our first audit of the DOD, November of last year. We're gaining great insight how to save money. In fact, if we were to go to a 1-year CR this year, there's $4 billion already been identified by the Department of Defense they don't want to spend, but they would be obliged to spend if we end up in a 1-year CR. You mentioned that earlier. Today, China spends, if you adjust it for purchasing power parity, almost on parity with the United States. Not that much different. And they're really focused on their naval forces. Their Belt Road Initiative, they've got 36 ports in Africa, 51 ports in South America that they've made these proprietary loans to. My fundamental question, sir, in a strategic relationship with Secretary Pompeo and Secretary of State, how do we deter China in a world that we see what their interests are in the West Pacific, South China Sea, et cetera, as well as Africa and Southern Asia? How do we use our allies and the relationship that we've had since World War II to actually deter not only China but Russia in this environment?
Yes, sir, you took the answer from me. First of all, we have to have a whole-of-government approach. So it's not just DOD, it's Department of State, it's USAID, it is HHS, it's DOJ. It's everybody has to be in on this because that is how the Chinese approach it. And then you're right, we have to really muster our allies and partners to do the same, whether it's in Europe or in Asia. And I will tell you, in Asia, many countries over there are quite concerned about China's influence. It is a hegemon, if you will, and if not that, exercising suzerainty over the region. So it's something we need to really work aggressively on, and if not, we were going to find ourselves. The Chinese are very patient. They are very strategic. If you go back to arguably probably their greatest leader, Deng Xiaoping, who had a famous saying that said something like, bide your time, hide your actions, play the long game. They are playing a long game, and we are playing the short game. I think that's where what's so important about the NDS is it points us to have our own long game so we can be at the right point in time. We don't want to be adversaries with China. We want to be competitors. We want to compete in the economic domain. But we have to make sure we're addressing the security concerns first.
As you consider this role and as the President chose you, it seems to me there are 3 big areas of areas to consider. One is your commitment to the National Defense Strategy. Are you today committed and satisfied that the National Defense Strategy will serve the interests not only of America but of the free world going forward?
Absolutely, Senator. What really impressed me about the defense strategy is that for the first time ever, it recognized China as a strategic competitor that could be an adversary if we're not careful. Look, I was in the Senate here in 2000, 2001, where we debated China's entry into the World Trade Organization, and we granted the authority. And the argument that we bought into at the time was if we let them into these institutions, they will democratize, they will become more benign, they will become a normal actor on the world stage. They proved us wrong.
Well, Michael Pillsbury in his book, 100-Year Marathon, admits, Henry Kissinger is talking about the same thing now. Hank Paulson says things in his new book that we got it wrong, that we believed Deng Xiaoping. I lived over there. And I can tell you we got it wrong. And we now know from the Made in China 2025 what their initiatives are to achieve. And my experience with the Chinese culture is that they never tell you, and this goes back to the Warring States period you mentioned earlier with Confucius and Sun Tzu, that they never tell you what they're going to do unless they've made a decision that you don't have the wherewithal or the will to stop them. Do you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
So the next thing, it seems to me you have to have a close relationship with our Secretary of State. Sounds like you have a long background with this individual who's in there now, right?
We have a common background.
And the third thing is I think we have to have a commitment that over the long term, that we're not turning into a militaristic country. President Eisenhower had that opportunity. He set the stage for the next several hundred years, I believe, by paying down the debt of World War II and keeping us from becoming a military state. Can you tell the rest of the world that that's not where we're headed with you as Secretary of Defense, and that the diplomacy answer you gave earlier, would you double down on that? And given your private sector background, explain how that depth gives you the ability to transcend both worlds.
I agree, Senator. I was going to say the greatest power we have is the power of our values and our culture. People around the world aspire to come to this country for those two things alone. That's why they line up in embassies and consulates in 180 other countries around the world to come to this country, because they know we believe in freedom and democracy and individual rights, and all that will be protected. And that's the power that we have to leverage, is the power of our values and our way of life and our government.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for your service and your willingness to continue to serve. You made a point in your opening statement that sort of jumped out at me that I hadn't really thought about explicitly before. Our adversaries don't have allies. We have allies.
That's right.
That's one of our asymmetrical advantages that we should maintain, it seems to me. You concur, I assume.
Absolutely concur. And as I also noted in my remarks, good alliances are made of strong, capable partners. And that's why when I went to NATO to tell them how much I support the alliance, I reminded them, too, that they also have Article III commitments to build their own capacity, to build their own capabilities. And that means living up to what I thought the Obama administration did a very good job at. That's advancing the Wells Summit initiative that everybody commit at least 2% of GDP to defense. And we're far away from that right now. But a successful collective security depends on everybody doing their fair share.
Absolutely. But the bottom line is that we have allies, they don't, and that's an advantage that we should maintain.
Not just maintain, we should keep growing it.
Absolutely.
We should expand our networks and alliances.
In his non-introduction, Senator Kaine mentioned Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August. And the strongest message of that book is mistakes and miscalculation leading to war. I saw a map this morning of military assets in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. There are so many opportunities for mistake and miscalculation on both sides. Do you have any specific plans, thoughts, strategies, tactics for deconfliction to avoid a miscalculation that could lead to a military confrontation with Iran?
Yes, Senator. In fact, I had the same thing came to mind when he mentioned Barbara Tuchman's book, is that miscalculation, in Sarajevo led to how many years of war and how many millions of people died on both sides. The one idea we had from a DoD perspective was to develop this Operation Sentinel, if you will, whereby we, working with our allies, mostly our allies and partners in the region, provide monitoring of the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, provide escorts and sentries to put ourselves in a place where we deter a provocation or a miscalculation. No better way was that most demonstrated recently when IRGC watercraft approached a British-owned vessel carrying oil, and it was and they likely would have either assaulted it or brought it into the Iranian shore and created an international incident were it not for a British warship intervening. And just the simple thing of appearing on the scene and putting the warship putting itself in between the IRGC boats and the merchant vessel was enough to deter something that could have escalated out of control. That's the type of concept we're trying to envision in DoD throughout the Strait, so we don't get into a military fight. We push it into the diplomatic realm.
Do we have any mill-to-mill contact with the Iranians? Do we have any opportunities to communicate as to what actually our intention? My concern is that to one side making a defensive, what they perceive to be a defensive move, the other side sees as an offensive move, and that's how we make mistakes and get on the escalation ladder.
In my short 21 days, I was not made aware of any direct contacts we have, but I do know that we do communicate them. I have through allies, where we signal what we're trying to do and why.
I was going to suggest that there may be some communications through allies in the region just to avoid again, a miscalculation.
I believe transparency and communication is always good in these types of situations so that, again, there is no misunderstanding about one's intentions.
Changing the subject, we've talked a lot about today about China, a lot about Russia. I'm concerned, and I'm seeing signs of connections between China and Russia, cooperation. Is this a concern, and do you see this as a sort of national strategy 2.0, dealing with a combined adversary?
I think you see a number of things happen. In some places, they are coordinating. In some places, they are cooperating. In other places, it's just a consonance of interests. And interestingly, in some places, they are competing. I know Senator Solon, he and I have talked about the Arctic. That's one area where
That's
Russia—
a surprise to me that you talked about the Arctic with Senator Solon, but go ahead.
It's shocking.
It is shocking.
That's one area where Russia—
Did he quote Billy Mitchell in that conversation? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Fehrenbach. So the Arctic is one place where Russia does not want China.
And
nor,
China
by the way,
has
do we want China.
China recently declared itself a near-Arctic nation, which
I guess near 900 miles constitutes near.
Yeah, right. It's on the same planet.
So I think you
but
see—
this is a concern, is it not, of linkages between the two?
Oh, yes, sir. I mean, that's absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why we need to work carefully with our allies and partners. In the context of the Arctic, we have great allies and partners who sit on the Arctic Council who can really help us in that regard, ensure there's nothing there. But in other areas as well, we need to work with our partners to keep that out. I mean, another country I'm very concerned about is Egypt. We see Egypt in some ways drifting off into that sphere, and I want to make sure that we get them back. It's the largest land army in the Arab army in the region, and they're an influencer, so we have to be very conscious of those facts.
And my time is up, but I assume you have similar concerns about Turkey and what's going on there.
Even more so, because they are a NATO ally. They've been a longstanding and very capable NATO ally, but their decision on the S-400 is the wrong one, and it's disappointing.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Esper, thank you for being here. I want to thank you and your wife for spending time down at Fort Bragg, taking a look at the military housing situation. So maybe I'll start there. Can you give me a brief update on anything that you've been tracking specifically about programmatic changes and some of the Tenant Bill of Rights, the things that the Army first started working on, it's been scaled up to the DOD?
Yes, sir. The last major effort I participated in about a month and a half ago, I made the time off, was I chaired, along with invited Secretary Spencer and Secretary Wilson. We sat down in our first quarterly CEO Board of Directors meeting with the opposing CEOs and talked through a number of issues. We presented them with our draft Bill of Rights for feedback and made clear that these are the things we were going to advance with regard to ensuring our service members were protected, that we wanted to standardize that across the services so that somebody moving from Fort here to Air Base there could have the same expectation of what their rights and responsibilities were, and that our next move was to really, once we nailed down that Bill of Rights, to translate that into updated tenant leasing agreements, again, so it was operationalized in a legal sense. And that's where I had left it. At the same time, we continued in the Army, at least, to move forward with conducting town halls and following up on any work orders. We were putting more and more people in place at each installation, Fort Bragg in particular, to make sure that we had our own people on place, on site, to ensure that during PCS transitions, that there was a third-party objective person to make sure that our families weren't being taken care of advantage. There's more and more. I think we've been trying to keep the committee informed as we went, but I'm very encouraged. The challenge will be sustaining it over the long haul, and that's going to be my commitment to this committee.
Thank you. You and I had breakfast over at the Pentagon a year or so ago, and you were going through your strategy to review every program, determine whether or not, and I'm not going to mention the one of my favorites here, but determine whether or not it really was given scarce resources worth pursuing certain programs. And I think in your opening testimony, you mentioned a number of these rocks that you've overturned. Everybody thought it wasn't worthwhile, but in totality, it's resulted in real savings. Can you talk a little bit about that briefly? I've got a couple other questions I hope we get in.
Yes, sir. At the end of the day, General Miller and I spent 50, 60 hours going program by program, over 500 programs, and at the end of the day, we reduced, eliminated, or delayed nearly, I think, 186 programs, produced over $30 billion in savings. It was a shift from the legacy to the future. I think it reflected our commitment to the National Defense Strategy, And that's the same type of approach I hope to bring to the department, if confirmed.
Okay, I'm going to ask you anyway. Did the grass-growing bullet program survive?
That's General Milley's favorite. I think that was killed long ago.
Okay. General Milley, the reality up here, and I know this is something Senator Perdue's very worried about, you know, it seems to be almost impossible for us to bridge the divide on funding. I'm very concerned that we're about to get into a posture of short-term CRs. Can you explain to this committee how disruptive that is to your mission, and particularly in the wake of what has been a pretty good cycle of the past couple of years for reliable funding?
Yes, sir. So a CR...
And what may suffer as a result?
Yes, sir. A CR, a continuing resolution, as you know, puts a number of limitations on what we can and cannot do. First of all, it funds the department at last year's level, which is likely not enough to begin with. But then it prohibits things like new starts, which is critical if you're trying to modernize the force consistent with the National Defense Strategy. It prohibits no changes in quantities for production. So we're trying to rebuild our munition stocks. If we find the need to increase the number of this munition or that munition, we will not be able to do it. And of course, if the money comes late or if you don't have enough money, you can't fill training seats in your schoolhouses. You cannot buy maintenance and repair parts to some degree. We have proposals across all the services to increase the end strength. That will not be, we likely will not be able to do that as well. So it impacts everything we do across the board. And in many cases, you can't reclaim that ground. You can't go back and fill a seat in a class. And so it has a direct impact on training.
Thank you. The last question I'd have for you, number one, I know that the other departments have done some of the work like you did in the Army. I hope we're going to see that identification of all programs and making tough choices go up to the DOD so that you can report back similar results in the other lines of service. But I think the other thing that we have to talk about, I don't expect you to get into details in response, but if we're not going to be able to end sequestration, repeal sequestration, one of the things we need to think about is what kind of authorities or other things we could potentially consider to lessen the impact on what I think is probably one of the worst votes that we've seen up here in modern history. So we just need your feedback on that so that we can weather the storm, because I think the storm's going to cycle around and potentially in this Congress.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Dr. Esper, are you familiar with the Stephen Covey phrase, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing?
I've not heard that before, but that's clever.
It's something that I like to remind myself to not focus on smaller order problems and leave bigger ones to get worse. And that's one of the reasons why I was very happy to hear you testify earlier with respect to Iran, that diplomacy should be our preferred position. I'm deeply worried about the escalating tensions with Iran for a number of reasons, including, I believe, an objective view would place the beginning of these escalations with the U.S. backing out of a diplomatic deal. And I don't want to be in a position where we would ever have to look our troops in the face and said, well, we had a diplomatic deal, we tore it up, and now we're going to have to send you into a war. I think that would be very difficult. But one of the other reasons that I'm worried about escalating tensions in the Middle East is I think the main thing right now, and General Milley testified essentially this last week, for the next probably century, is the relationship between the United States and China is going to be definitive, not only for our nations, but even for the world.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I agree, Senator. The challenge we have is making sure that the near-term challenges don't consume our commitment and resourcing to the far-term, the far greater challenges that we have to get on now. We can't wait 10 or 15 years. So I think that's the biggest challenge we face right now.
I very much worry that another war against a smaller, weaker, faraway nation would take away our focus on China. And China is a full-spectrum competitor. General Milley was talking about, and we've talked in this hearing, you know, it could be air, sea, land, cyber, space, but outside of the military realm, economic, trade, diplomacy. It is a full-spectrum competitor, and we have to focus on it. Let me ask you a question about sort of your philosophy about this. As we focused in earlier generation on the Soviet Union as a key threat, one of our strong assets was the network of allies, beginning with Truman and NATO and Article 5 and joint defense. We had partners and allies to a degree that the Soviet Union did not. They had satellite nations, but they didn't have the same network of partners. Move over, extract the lesson, and let's move over into Asia right now. My view of China is They do a lot of deals, but they don't have allies to the same degree we do. And even when we're in nations where they're doing a lot of deals, there's a skepticism about China's intent. We don't have the same formalized alliance structure in the Indo-PACOM as we do in Europe, and maybe we don't need it. You know, you need to do things that are right for today, not just recreate old models. We have a lot of bilateral relationships, but talk a little bit long-term from the perspective, if you were Secretary, what would your thinking be about sort of the alliances in the Indo-PACOM and how we could use those to advance our common interests?
Senator, I think you've covered it well. I mean, we do have our alliances in Asia are anchored bilaterally with, you know, the principal Australia, Japan, and Korea. In a perfect world, you'd expand that and bring them all together, but there are obviously historical animosities to go back to World War II and prior that prevent that. So I think our challenge is to continue building as much as we can, alliances and partnerships. I think ASEAN is a good place to start to expand that. But the bigger issue you mentioned, and it's what concerns me, is we eventually won in the Cold War because Russia did not have the economic might to win at the end, and they were using force. They were compelling people to be in their orbit, to be part of the Warsaw Pact. China has great economic power and potential, and they're using it. They're using it in the region to influence others, either overtly or covertly, if you will. They're taking advantage of countries, small countries who need capital, and they're getting them into debt in a way that they are able to capture strategic ports, critical minerals and resources, you name it. But one of the biggest concerns is simply that they will use their economic might that is only growing. I mean, it's just a matter of time before they match us and possibly surpass us, that they will use that in a way that will pull even likely partners, if not our current ones, away from us. That is the big challenge that I think we face with China that we didn't face with Russia.
And that is a full spectrum. That's not just a DOD responsibility, although the DOD owns a big chunk of it, but there are others as well.
Yes, sir. That was my response earlier. I think we got to leverage USAID. We got to leverage our values, our culture. We got to every department of the United States government.
How is the DOD and the administration viewing Turkey's decision on the S-400 as a disappointing acquisition decision, or as a fundamental change in direction and possibly a fundamental change in the nature of the U.S.-Turkey relationship?
It's certainly disappointing. Those are my words. Very disappointing. You know, Turkey has been a long-standing NATO ally, a very capable one. I think they were one of the original allies, if I think back to when the alliance formed. And so it is very disheartening to see how they've drifted over the past several years. And but the view is the policy that I've communicated to my counterpart, if confirmed, defense minister, is that you can either have the S-400 or you can have the F-35. You cannot have both. Acquisition of the S-400 fundamentally undermines the capabilities of the F-35 and our ability to retain that overmatch in the skies going forward.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Esper, congratulations on your nomination. I think you're a fantastic candidate. I look forward to supporting you. I've been very encouraged today to hear you talk about the importance of NDS and the much-needed strategic focus that it brings, not just to the department, but to the nation's political leadership, and hopefully across the whole of government, and also about the nature of China as a strategic competitor here and now. I want to talk more about that in a little bit more detail, if I could. If China were to seize control of Taiwan, what would that mean for U.S. interests and for a free and open Indo-Pacific more broadly?
Well, first of all, it would affect our obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. So that's the first thing that came to mind when you said that. Clearly, what it does is it signals, contrary to what the Chinese like to say, that they are willing to use force to get their way. It's something they promised. Obviously, they consider Taiwan a part of China. There are historical ties there, if you will, that they say, and cultural ones. But I think that would be that would really change the dynamics of the Pacific, and it would really cause a lot of concern to all their neighbors and partners for the reasons that we were discussing earlier. And by the way, I think that's part of what you see playing out in the streets of Hong Kong these days. Is a lot of concern about what's happening since China assumed control of Hong Kong in 1997.
The department, rightly in my view, has said that a Chinese fait accompli in relationship to Taiwan is a major threat that we need to focus on. Now, I've heard some argue, and recently, that the best way to defeat a Chinese fait accompli in Taiwan is by escalating horizontally, by deliberately expanding the conflict in order to impose costs on China without actually defeating the attack itself. And I just have to say, for my own part, I'm not convinced by this. This sounds to me like a way to impose significantly more costs on this country, more lives lost, more treasure expended, whereas we could be focusing on blunting the initial Chinese assault and then defeating them in as limited a conflict as possible. So let me just ask you, in your opinion, what would it take to defeat a Chinese fait accompli in the way that best limits the cost and the danger to Americans?
Senator, I'd like to begin far left of the fight and talk about how do we continue to engage the Chinese, encourage their development as a normal nation, as a responsible player in the international realm, if you will. How do we restrict our competition with them to the economic realm, and how do we resolve problems diplomatically? That's where I think we need to go. We do not need a war with China, and that's kind of my approach, is how do we deter conflict?
As we think about that deterrence, however, and planning for it and signal what it is that we were going to do if we were confronted with situations that we don't like, such as a Chinese aggression against Taiwan or elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific, what is your view on how we best limit the potential exposure to us in any such conflict? I mean, how are we going to counter Chinese aggression should that ultimately come to pass? What this question is really about is how we're going to prepare to do it. We hope not to have to do it, but if we have to do it, how are we going to be prepared to do it in a way that limits our exposure, limits the danger to us, but is also effective?
So, I believe in Ronald Reagan's dictum, peace through strength. So we have to have really capable forces, as I said in my opening remarks, whether it's in the cyber space and your conventional domains of air and land and subsurface, by the way, is important in that theater, is have such a capable military that, that we deter any conflict whatsoever. That's number one. Number two, it goes back to building a network of capable allies and partners who can help us present a much bigger display of commitment and resolve than we would otherwise, as ones or twos. And so I think we need to look aggressively. Again, where else we can develop relationships, that's one thing I hope to do is pursue, if confirmed, pursue new partnerships with countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and others to really build a community of like-minded nations who aren't there to confront China, but to deter bad behavior and making sure we embrace and sustain the international rules-based order that has sustained us now for decades.
By my count, over $20 billion has now been directed towards the European Deterrence Initiative, EDI, since fiscal year 2015. Would you support an initiative like EDI in the Indo-Pacific to make sure that Indo-PACOM has what it needs to address near-term operational shortfalls?
Yes, sir, in principle. I'd want to understand where the money's coming from to pay for that and all that, but we have to, again, approach these issues holistically.
One last thing here. I've made clear my support for the President's commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific, and as part of that effort, I think it's essential that our regional allies contribute to their fair share to their defense. And with that in mind, how should we expect Taiwan and others to contribute to their defense, whether in terms of military acquisitions or otherwise?
Well, I support the, Taiwan, sales to Taiwan. It's, again, a commitment we made under the Taiwan Relations Act. I've seen, in my years in D.C., successive administrations commit to that and fulfill it in various ways. And so that's a place to begin right there with arms sales. It just gives them a capability, it builds interoperability and so forth. And so that's where I would start on that front.
Thank you, Dr. Esper. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Esper, prior to becoming Army Secretary, you were the top lobbyist for Raytheon, which of course is the nation's third largest defense contractor. Now, under current ethics rules, you're prohibited from participating in any decisions involving Raytheon for 2 years after your appointment as Army Secretary. But because you have already been in government for 20 months, that recusal period is set to expire in November, which means you will soon be able to participate personally and substantially in matters involving your former employer. That's a conflict of interest given that Raytheon does billions of dollars worth of business every year with the Defense Department. So, Secretary Esper, your predecessor, Acting Secretary Shanahan, committed to extend his recusal from all matters involving his former employer, Boeing, for the duration of his government service. If you're confirmed, will you do the same and commit to extending your recusal from any and all matters involving Raytheon for the duration of your tenure as Secretary of Defense?
You know, Senator, we had this discussion in your office.
Yes, we did.
We had this discussion a couple years ago. You know, on the advice of my ethics folks at the Pentagon, the career professionals, no, the recommendation is not to. The belief is that the screening process I have in place, all the rules and regulations and law that I'm required.
So let's just cut to it. You're not going to do what Acting Secretary Shanahan agreed to do, and that is agree not to be involved in decisions involving your former employer where you were head lobbyist for the duration of your time as Secretary of Defense.
Senator, I can't explain why he made that commitment. We obviously come to the, he was.
But you are not willing to make the same commitment, is that right?
He was fulfilling a different role than I am, and he obviously.
You are unwilling to make that same commitment, is that right, Dr. Esper?
He has a different professional background than I
I'll
do.
take that as a yes, you're unwilling to make that commitment. That is not the only ethics problem with your nomination. Part of the deal you got from Raytheon when you left as their top lobbyist was at least $1 million in deferred compensation after 2022. Now, the law prohibits you from participating in matters that would affect Raytheon's ability or willingness to hand you this massive payout. But there's a catch. In a recent memo, you detailed an exception to your ethics obligations by writing that you can get a waiver to participate in matters that directly and predictably affect Raytheon's financial interests if it's, quote, so important that it cannot be referred to another official, end quote. This smacks of corruption, plain and simple. So here's my question. Will you commit that during your time as Defense Secretary that you will not seek any waiver that will allow you to participate in matters that affect Raytheon's financial interests?
Well, Senator, let me correct the record with regard to what you said. At any time in the past 20-some months, to include the last 3 weeks, did I request or seek or receive or be granted any waiver?
I appreciate, Dr. Esper, that you have not in the past asked for one, but you're the one who has detailed an exception to your ethics obligation by saying that you can seek a waiver in the future. And so I'm asking, if you're confirmed, will you agree not to seek such a waiver? I think it's a fair question. It's a yes or no. I have other ethics issues I'd like to cover.
I know, but I would like to, I think this is a good debate.
No, I'm not trying to have a debate.
No, I know, but I'm trying to assure you of my.
You will agree not to seek such a waiver.
So let me just read to you. This is a letter from the Director of the Standards of Conduct Office.
I'll take it then as a no, you will not agree not to seek such a waiver.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to
I have a third question to ask about ethics. I think I'm entitled to ask these questions,
I just want to answer your
Chairman.
question.
His question is a yes or no.
I'm going to
Will
interrupt
he
for a
agree?
moment here. I think that Dr. Esper has the opportunity, should have the opportunity to answer the questions that you're asking. You've asked several questions. He's trying to answer a question. We'd like to recognize him to answer that question.
I presume, Mr. Chairman, I'll get extra time then?
Yeah, you can have extra time
Yes, sir. So I would just like to submit this for the record. It's a statement from the Director of the Standards of Conduct Officer. I won't read the whole thing in the interest of time, but it says, quote, at no time while serving as a Secretary of the Army or the Acting Secretary of Defense did you, he's writing to me, request, seek, or receive a waiver or authorization related to your ethics agreement and ethics obligations, unquote.
Okay,
and I'll
Senator Warren.
the record.
So I stipulated earlier that I understand you have not asked in the past, so I'll ask my question again. Will you agree not to ask for a waiver during the time you serve as Secretary of Defense?
No, Senator, I won't, because I'm going to continue to abide by the rules and regulations, and I'm going to
Thank you.
And I'm
have
going to
a
continue to
third
consult
question.
closely with my ethics personnel to ensure that we stay in the ethical midfield.
I recently introduced legislation to block the revolving door between the Pentagon and giant defense contractors like Raytheon by prohibiting big defense contractors from hiring former senior DoD officials for 4 years after they leave government. If it were the law, you couldn't go back to work at Raytheon or any other defense contractor immediately. In other words, it would help close the revolving door. If confirmed, will you commit not to work for or get paid by any defense contractor for at least 4 years after your government service?
No, Senator, I will not.
All right, so let me get this straight. You're still due to get at least $1 million payout from when you lobbied for Raytheon. You won't commit to recuse yourself from Raytheon's decision. You insist on being free to seek a waiver that would let you make decisions affecting Raytheon's bottom line and your remaining financial interests. And you won't rule out taking a trip right back through the revolving door on your way out of government service, or even just delaying that trip for 4 years after you leave government. Secretary Esper, the American people deserve to know that you're making decisions in our country's best security interests, not in your own financial interests. You can't make those commitments to this committee. That means you should not be confirmed as Secretary of Defense.
Senator, if I may answer your question. At the age of 18, I went to West Point, and I swore an oath to defend this Constitution. And I embraced a motto called duty and honor and country. And I've lived my life in accordance with those values ever since then. I went to war for this country. I served overseas for this country. I've stepped down from jobs that paid me well more than what I was working anywhere else. And each time it was to serve the public good and to serve the young men and women of our armed services. So no, I disagree. I think the presumption is, for some reason, anybody who comes from the business or the corporate world is corrupt.
So I'm asking the question.
Excellent
No.
stuff.
This is not right, Mr. Chairman.
Senator
He does
Sullivan
not. I
is
didn't ask a
recognized.
question
Senator
at the end.
Sullivan's, you've gone 2 minutes over.
No,
your
I
time.
haven't gone over.
Yes,
He
you
has
have.
gone over. And he
Senator
is
Sullivan,
not willing to make a
recognized.
commitment that he will not engage in conflicts of interest
Thank you,
for
Mr.
the
Chairman.
company for which he was a lobbyist. This is outrageous.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Secretary Esper for your service to our country. I want to thank the family members here. I have three children myself, and it's not always easy. Families are in public service as well, so I want to thank you for all that you've done for your dad and your spouse. Mr. Secretary, I'm going to ask you let's just get back to this issue. Will you commit to abide by all laws and ethics requirements regarding your prior employment with regard to Raytheon? Unequivocally.
Absolutely. And can I make one other point on this?
You may.
I think it's important. It'll take me 30 seconds. President Obama strongly believed in ethics in government. As he was staffing out his cabinet in 2009, he reached out to the top lobbyist at Raytheon at the time, and he brought him into his government to be the Deputy Secretary of Defense with only a one-year recusal, because he was a good man and he was an ethical man. And that person, by the way, was confirmed unanimously by this committee and went to the floor of the Senate and was confirmed by the vote of 93-4. Because I think that was the right decision to make. I thought that person brought a great.
Let me raise another issue. I had a bunch of questions, but this is important. You saw Senator Round, Senator Cotton raise this issue as well. Senator Warren casually throws out the word corruption. Casually throws out the word corruption. Hopefully you're going to get a little stink on it. In your 27 years of service to your country, as a military officer, as a staffer, as someone who's gone to war for America, have you ever been accused of corruption before?
No, sir, never in my life.
Thank you. You and I have had many good meetings. I appreciated our visits up in Alaska. Let me highlight a couple areas where I think the Pentagon needs to focus more. You've heard a lot about allies from both sides, which I think is important. You talked about the National Defense Strategy. Senator Hawley was talking about China. I think the National Defense Strategy does a great job in terms of raising the issue of the rise of China and our focus on the Indo-Pacific. One area where I think we need to do a better job is our force posture in the region. Will you commit to work with this committee with regard to our force posture in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, sir, because I think it's wholly consistent with the National Defense Strategy, which is what I'm committed to do.
Let me talk to the issue of the Arctic. I don't want to disappoint Senator King by not raising these issues, so I will. You know, it does seem like most agencies in town, with the exception of the Pentagon, are focused on this. You may have seen Secretary Pompeo gave a very important speech on the strategic interests we have. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to submit for the record several articles just in the last couple of weeks that focus on Russia, China's interest in the Arctic, how it's a strategic area, how a lot of Washington is waking up to this, with the exception of the Pentagon. You and I have talked about this a lot. Let me just give you one example. The Russians are doing all kinds of things, new ports, new airfields, new military commands in the Arctic. Putin's talking about the Arctic as the new Suez Canal, and that they're going to control. And we had a provision in this year's NDAA that just said America should have a
port, which it doesn't have right now, that could handle resupplying a destroyer, not even an aircraft carrier, in the Arctic. The Pentagon opposed this. Fortunately, this committee rolled the Pentagon's bad advice. Can you commit to me to work with this committee to taking a strong look, a personal look, at America's strategic and military interests in the Arctic and how to protect those?
Yes, Senator, I do.
Let me talk a little bit about Alaska. Mr. Secretary, you had the opportunity to visit Alaska as Secretary of the Army. I like to say Alaska constitutes 3 pillars of America's military might. We're the cornerstone of missile defense. We're a platform for expeditionary forces like the 425 and the 1st Stryker Brigade, which is getting ready to go to Iraq. And we're the hub of air combat power for the Arctic and the Asia-Pacific. As a matter of fact, by the end of next year, we will have over 100 fifth-generation combat-coded fighters based in Alaska. Because of our strategic location, because of the fact, as Billy Mitchell did say, again, I don't want to disappoint Senator King, that Alaska was the most strategic place in the world, given its strategic location. The Air Force is evaluating its OCONUS locations and deployments of KC-46s. Alaska has 50-year-old tankers up there. What kind of strategic message would we send our potential adversaries like Russia, like China, like North Korea, where supersonic fighters can get to these places from Alaska within just a few hours, if we were to co-locate over 100 fifth-generation fighters with KC-46 tankers in such a strategic area? What kind of message would we be sending, and will you commit to work with me in this committee for the most strategic OCONUS placements of our KC-46 fleet when the Air Force is looking to do that?
I will, Senator.
And what kind of message would that co-location send?
Well, I think what it would send, it's hypothetical, is that we are committed to the NDS and that we'd have extreme strategic reach if you were to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Esper, for your service, for you being here. Thank you to your family for their support for your service. I appreciate all the work that we've done since I've been in the Senate and the time we spent the other day talking about your nomination. We have talked, and you have mentioned several times, I think in almost every question, a commitment to the NDS. And I think we all are committed to this. I think my question, though, involves how often should we be looking at the NDS? How should we tweak it? For instance, we have pulled out of the JCPOA. We've seen Iran now enriching uranium. Clearly, one would argue, on a path toward nuclear arms. So how often do we look at that, and what adjustments, do you know of any adjustments that need to be made now, and particularly if, in fact, we have a nuclear-armed Iran? How would that affect implementation of the NDS?
I think strategy should be reviewed constantly and certainly referred to constantly. And as events change, you need to adapt your strategy to the world that you live in. So I think it's a continuous, ongoing process. There's nothing in the world right now that jumps out to me that says we need to change. While the NDS speaks about Russia and China as strategic competitors in this era of great power competition, it also explicitly cites the fact that we have to deal in the meantime with regional challenges such as Iran and North Korea and others.
Well, as you look forward, though, clearly we're seeing Iran on a path with their nuclear program. Are there things that we need to be doing now that we need to prepare to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear arms?
I do think we need to get back into a negotiated path with them, preferably an updated version of JCPOA, if you will, that addresses with finality a verifiable, irreversible, and permanent prohibition on their nuclear work and efforts. So that'd be number one. And then we also need to address the means to deliver them, ICBMs. So to me, those are two things, at least two things in a modified JCPOA that we would want to address. And I don't think, as you look across all the countries, even those who supported JCPOA 1, that people would agree that we do not need Iran to go down that path. It's just it's bad for the region, and it's bad for the continent of Europe as well.
All right, thank you. I want to get back to also the discussion we've had about alliances. Everybody understands the alliances and how important there is. But it's easier to say and talk about in a hearing than to do. And clearly Russia, China, Iran, everyone is trying to threaten our alliances, to break up our alliances. That's pretty obvious from whether it is what China is doing at the Belt and Roads Initiative to what China is doing, particularly in Turkey. My question, though, is, what can we do better? Because it seems to me that some of our government's own actions is also undermining those alliances. We got trade policies where we're fighting with our friends. We've got, which is giving them the opportunity to talk to China. We've got the president often undermines his own intelligence, folks, by saying this whole Russian interference is fake news and a hoax, and cozying up, and that's a term that gets used often to the leader of North Korea, the leader of Russia, the leader, and others. What are we doing wrong in terms of that? And can't we also undermine those alliances by the actions of the government? And what would you suggest we do different?
Well, I think, first of all, from a DOD perspective, we need to keep doing now what we're doing well. I've had the chance on many occasions in the past 2 years as Secretary of the Army to visit our Joint Maneuver Center at Hohenfels, Germany, where we train all of our allies together, fighting against a notional Russian threat, if you will. So we need to sustain those things. And by the way, that was a big change from when I last served in Italy in the early 1990s. So we need to sustain those things. And then I will tell you, when I attended the Defense Ministerial in Brussels about 2.5, 3 weeks ago now as Acting Secretary, we were having very honest, very candid discussions, thinking ahead on any number of things by which we could improve the alliance in terms of its readiness. We talked about what's called the 4x30s initiative. It was an idea by General Mattis where we had 30 squadrons, 30 surface combatants, and 30 brigades ready within 30 days. And we are taking that seriously in terms of how we develop that. We talked a lot about 5G. How do we make sure that we keep 5G and Huawei out of our networks? And so the alliance is really looking forward. I think they have a great leader we have in Jens Stoltenberg.
Well, Mr. Secretary, let me just ask you this question, though. When the president does some things, are you willing to stand up and say, Mr. President, your actions may be undermining our ability to strengthen these alliances? Can you do that?
My commitment to all of you is that I will always give the president or all of you my candid, honest advice, what I think is the right course of action.
And I believe your commitment, sir. I appreciate your time and effort, and I look forward to your confirmation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for all of your service and to your family. It's tremendous. And by the way, sacrificial service. And I know that throughout that service, I'm sure you've faced people who've disagreed with your line of work, have probably even been hostile at times. I'm sorry it had to happen in this committee, and just know that, as you can tell, by and large, we're not here to question your integrity. That's already been well established by lots of people. I appreciated both in your opening statement and in your answers to questions of Senator Fisher, your commitment to the nuclear triad, the importance of that deterrence, and specifically the ground-based strategic deterrent. As you know, North Dakota is home to about 150 of the Minuteman IIIs scheduled by the Air Force to be replaced as part of the modernization effort somewhere in the 2028 to 2035 time frame as they are assumed, or an analysis determined that they'd probably be aging out the legacy missiles about that time. But there are some that want to delay that think that further study is required. One of the things I've really appreciated that you've mentioned multiple times, and that is the importance of understanding the long game, being committed to a long-term plan, commitment to the NDS. Can you speak just a little further about the importance of that, specifically that one part of the triad, the ground-based strategic deterrent, and why sticking to the time frame is important?
The time frame is important because we do need to modernize the triad. It needs to be the two parts of deterrence are having a capability and the will to use it. The capability means that the triad, at least in this case, the ground-based strategic deterrent must be reliable, must be effective. We want it to be safe as well. And it needs to build in all those other mechanisms. It needs to be cyber protected, for example. So that is a reason to modernize it. And as I said, each leg of the triad provides different capabilities. In the case of our ground-based strategic deterrents, you have much quicker means of communication. They can reach targets much more quickly. And because they're at a fixed site, they are more accurate. So all those things are arguments in favor of having a ground-based strategic deterrent option.
Thank you. Another issue that you've raised a fair bit, and we've talked about the new domain of space as well as cyber. As you know, the Defense Authorization Act that came out of this committee and then the Senate includes standing up a Space Force. The House, similarly, they call it a Space Corps. But we have had some serious consideration and discussion and some disagreement on what the leadership ought to look like for that. And I know there have been multiple options that have been presented, proposals by the administration, DOD. The one we settled on was a version of the most recent, and that is something that would be similar to the Marine relationship to the Navy. I guess I'd be interested just in your thoughts about that and what we've settled on. The leadership model is where I focused a lot of my attention, is ensuring that there's a permanent seat with the Joint Chiefs, that the responsibility of the commanders to answer directly to the Secretary of the Air Force. But some of that's been in dispute, and I'd just be interested in your observations.
Well, I obviously support the budget proposal that we put forward with regard to standing up the Space Force. At this point in time, the House has a view on that, and the Senate has a view, and I think, obviously, if confirmed, I'd want to engage the committee as you approach conference, both committees, to come up with the right solution. But I think when you step back from it, you have to ask yourself, what are we trying to do? And I think what we're trying to do is recognize that space is no longer a place from which we support combat operations or from which we look down upon the world and see what's happening. It is now a warfighting domain, not because we made it that way, but because the Russians and Chinese are making it that way. And so what you want to do as much as possible to make sure we are sufficiently robust in the space warfighting domain is to ensure you have unity of command and unity of effort, people who are focused on that as a warfighting thing going forward. The closest analogy I have to this, and I think I may have mentioned to you, is when in 1947 they pulled the Army Air Corps out of the United States Army. It freed up our aviators to think about warfighting in the air domain and how you conduct warfare, unencumbered by a hierarchy, if you will, that was focused on ground combat. And so that's how I think about this problem. I think we just got to realize that it is a new domain of warfare now, and it requires a different organizational construct and a different way of thinking about it.
I think your illustration's right on point, and I appreciate, again, your service and your good answers. I yield.
Yeah, and I appreciate that also, since I'm one of the few up here who was around at that time. I remember vividly. But I would like to announce that questions for the record, we're going to try to expedite this, and we're going to have a deadline on questions for the record that have to be submitted by close of business today. And we say that to the members, and I'd ask any staff that's representing someone here today to tell their member the same thing. Senator Manchin.
Secretary Esper, thank you very much for being here today and the service you've given to our country. Thank your family for being and attending with you. I've often told my children and my grandchildren, and we put ourselves forward to serve in public service. I said, you're going to hear a lot of things, and when you do, you're going to get upset about it, and it kind of bothers you and all that, but it's a very small price to pay when you think about the great opportunities in life we have, living in the greatest democracy and the freedoms that we have. That's a very small price to pay, so I hope you realize that this is part of this process. I'm sure there are people in the private sector that would like for all of us to sign a 4-year deal. No books, no speaking engagements, no income enhancement after we leave public service. I'm sure they're out there. So with that being said, thank you for your service and in your stellar career. I will want to get to the thing that you and I have talked about, and you were kind enough to come and we sat down. The defense industrial base has long been targeted for foreign espionage, as we know. The Chinese are the greatest proliferators of that. And just to show the public a little bit, here is the Javelin, the United States FGM-148 Javelin anti-tank missile, and it shows the H-12 Red Arrow anti-tank missile from the Chinese. Here we have the General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper UAV, and if you look below, you have the CH-4 Rainbow UAV from China. If you look also at Northrop Grumman MQ-8 Fire Scout Unmanned Helo, and look down below, Secretary, the Chinese SVU-200 Flying Tiger Unmanned Helo. And then at the top of the food chain, the Lockheed Martin F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, and you look at the Cheyenne J-31 fighter. Now, there's no way this could have been, absolutely no way any of this could have been accomplished in the record time that they did it if it wasn't for the espionage. So you and I spoke about this before, so I would ask you, how are you planning to hold those services in the entire food chain, not just at the top? And we've talked about this. How can we do this, sir, and hold everybody accountable? Because right now there's no repercussion whatsoever. If they've been stolen, espionage is happening at the lower food chain, which is going to be a subcontractor to a subcontractor, somebody at the top of the food chain has to be held responsible. So you might want to answer that.
Yes, sir. The Chinese are probably perpetrating the greatest theft of intellectual property in human history in terms of what they're doing, and directly with regard to our national security. I'm well aware of this. I said earlier when we talked about cyber that I think we were vulnerable. Defensively, we were nearly not as strong as our offensive, so we need to build it up. My time in private sector, one of the experiences I bring is that, you know, the bigger companies have the means to address cybersecurity. They're working pretty hard, and they're conscious of their supply chains. But when you work your way down at those chains, the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth tier, they simply just don't have the means to protect themselves. And oftentimes, in my experience, again, in the private sector, and the committee had a hearing on this under Senator Levin many years ago, that's where the Chinese were getting in.
We know where they're getting in.
They were working their way in at the small tiers.
I think quickly, Mr. Secretary, if I could just ask you, would you be receptive to basically holding the primary contractor responsible for the entire food chain of the product they've been awarded?
I'd have to think about that, and not because I'm trying to dodge it, but because there are obviously legal restrictions on what you can require. But I do think we need to tackle it together, because I agree with you on the threat.
We're not going to stop it, of everything I'm passing around here. That'll never be stopped unless we hold everyone accountable, and at the big boys at the top that have the money to do this, to protect, but also protect the opportunity for those people to be able to contract to them. The second thing, very quickly, I'll follow up with this.
Again, I just don't want to put a mandate on the small guy who can't afford to do something.
No, it's not going to be on the small guy. I'm saying hold the top guy responsible.
Well, sometimes they interpret that as kind of then requiring.
Oh, they'll pass it down if they can. I understand that, but.
And I understand that, too.
That's where the market's got to balance itself out, but we've got to have protections built in.
Sure.
So I look forward to working with you. National Guard. We get so many experts, and when you look at basically what we've got 54 cyber teams in National Guard. There are National Guard space units in 7 states with 1,400 National Guard members conducting space duties. All this expertise, and sometimes there's still kind of a shun from our mainstream military, if you will, to a part-time National Guard, which is not the National Guard we've known. Right. Tell me how you intend to strengthen that, if you can expedite that, and basically build off of that.
I agree,
cost-saving measures.
I think it's a great asset. When I came to the Army 2 years ago, I was really impressed that we were building the teams at that time. These are very capable people that Monday through Friday are working for companies, they're doing IT, they're involved in the space, and I think we need to continue to go after them, recruit them, adapt our personnel management procedures to get them in and have them work for us on the weekends, doing either offensive, defensive, preferably offensive cyber.
Yeah. Thank you, Secretary. I look forward to voting for you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Senator Scott.
I want to thank Secretary and your family. Thank you for your dedicated years of service, and you're a highly qualified candidate. I'm very disappointed that Senator Warren would demonize you after your decades of service simply because you served in the private sector. There's a lot of us that have been in the private sector, and that doesn't take anything away from our ability to do our job. I guess she just needed a moment for a presidential campaign, but I believe you deserve to be confirmed, and I know you've done a great job as Secretary of Army, and I know you'll do a great job in this. As you know, as we talked about, one of my biggest concerns is Venezuela. We've got Maduro is clearly killing citizens. Kids like my grandkids, don't have food, water, medicine. They're dying constantly. I've been to the border. Many of us have. Russia's there, China's there, Iran's there, Hezbollah's there, ELN's there, ISIS is there. All the bad guys are there. Cuba's there. Xi and Putin are putting up with this and supporting it. It's wrong. So my question for you is our country spent a fortune in time and money in the Middle East. And what the question is what's the status of our U.S. forces and their readiness in this hemisphere to not only deter, but to defeat any enemy that seeks to harm us? I think this is national security, us or our allies. And do our enemies even think we care about what's going on? Because if you look at the amount of troops we have in this hemisphere versus all over the world, you wouldn't think that they think we have any concern.
Senator, I think we discussed this at another meeting we had, but this is, it's